It started like a whisper in the trees, and then everything stopped. On an ordinary morning along Highway 191, right where the road curves near the old pine stretch, cars came to a standstill. Not because of an accident or a snowstorm, but because of something far more surreal. Bears. Hundreds of them. They weren't running. They weren't roaring. They simply stood. Black bears, grizzlies, old, young, motionless, quiet. A living wall of fur and breath, stretching across the asphalt like ancient sentinels summoned from another time. Truck drivers turned off their engines. Phones started recording. But no one honked. No one moved. Because something in the air held them. Something they couldn't name. It wasn't fear. It was reverence. For creatures so famously solitary, this moment defied nature itself. There were no signs of panic, no hunting behavior, no visible threat. Just presence. Pure, unshakable presence. As if the earth itself had called them together. And while most saw animals, a few began to wonder if it was something else. A signal. A rescue of another kind. Something bigger than any story we've been told. But what could they have sensed? And why now? It wasn't just the stillness of the bears that unsettled people. It was the way they looked at nothing and everything, all at once. Eyes locked on a horizon that no human eye could see. Their posture wasn't defensive, it was deliberate. Like monks before a revelation, or soldiers before the storm. Word of the strange. Gathering spread fast. Wildlife rangers, scientists, park volunteers, all tried to find some rational explanation. Maybe it was a food source, migration, territorial behavior, but no theory stood for long. Nothing explained why so many different bears, natural loners, would congregate peacefully, or why they'd block the highway of all places, in complete silence. Witnesses described an energy that couldn't be filmed, a weight in the air, something thick, ancient, pressing on the chest. One woman said it felt like standing inside a church that wasn't built by men. Another man, a veteran trucker, pulled over and wept in his cab. "They weren't there for us," he said later, "but they made us stop anyway." Some stories carry a truth that science hasn't caught up with, and this felt like one of those. No growls, no warning, just presence. Just that animal hush, the kind that wraps around your bones when something's about to shift. It wasn't long before theories turned spiritual. People began digging into tribal legends, old stories passed down through generations, where bears weren't just animals, but messengers, protectors, carriers of the earth's voice. Some said it reminded them of the ancient tales where animals appeared before great change, not to bring chaos but to offer a silent warning. The Shoshone people, whose ancestral land includes parts of Yellowstone, speak of bears as the breath between worlds, the moment where nature whispers before it cries, a quiet held between disaster and deliverance. And the strangest part? The bears weren't the only ones affected. Park rangers started reporting odd behaviors in other species. Elk refusing to graze, wolves howling in midday silence, birds circling the same tree for hours. A natural rhythm had been interrupted. Something deep had stirred. Many started to believe that what they were witnessing wasn't random. It was a message. But from where? From what? And while officials avoided making public statements, those who stood near the bears, they didn't need words. They felt it. A low hum in the ground, a pressure in the wind, as if the mountain itself was trying to speak through fur and breath and stillness. There were no footprints of panic, only intention. No broken branches, no marks of struggle, only grace. In a world addicted to noise and speed, this sudden stillness felt sacred. Or perhaps like a prayer we weren't meant to hear with ears, but with instinct. And maybe, just maybe, with humility. But whatever the bears were sensing, it hadn't surfaced yet. Not fully. And just as quickly as they had come, the bears began to withdraw. Not all at once, not in fear, one by one, as if on cue, like something had told them, "It's time." But the silence they left behind, that lingered longer than the footprints. And a few days later, the earth finally stirred. It started like a breath you almost don't notice, just a whisper beneath the roots. 3 days after the bears began to leave, seismographs in the Yellowstone region registered something strange. Not dramatic, not the kind of event that would make headlines, but subtle, uneasy, like the first ripple on still water before a storm. Tiny tremors, almost imperceptible. Most would have called them nothing. Background murmurs in the bones of the planet. But those who had stood on that highway, who had looked into the eyes of those animals, knew better. The earth had answered. What's unsettling is how cleanly it lined up. The bears had gathered with inexplicable precision, and just as they stepped away, the land stirred. Experts reviewed their data over and over, expecting some human error, a glitch. But the pattern held. The same week the grizzlies came, the ground beneath Yellowstone had changed. The tremors were shallow, but not random. And then came the questions no one could quite silence, at least not in the quiet corners of scientific meetings or ranger stations after hours. Could they have sensed it before us? Before machines? Before logic? Some geologists remained cautious. Correlation is not causation, they repeated, like a spell. But others weren't so sure anymore. Yellowstone, after all, isn't just a national park. It sits atop one of the most powerful supervolcanoes in the world, a sleeping force so vast that its awakening could reshape continents. Thankfully, it hadn't erupted for thousands of years. But even the smallest changes in its deep reservoirs are monitored with obsessive precision. Only this time, the first to respond hadn't been humans. It had been animals. The tremors, though minor, clustered near geothermal vents that had recently shifted temperature. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to catch the eye of seasoned researchers. Enough to justify late-night phone calls. Enough to make a few scientists revisit old papers on animal behavior and seismic precognition. A fringe field suddenly pressing against the mainstream. But beyond the numbers and graphs, there was something more primal at play, something that didn't fit into charts or headlines. There's a kind of knowledge that doesn't need to be spoken, something born of fur, soil, and time. Some called it instinct, others, a sixth sense. But to the few who stood still long enough to feel it, it felt like reverence. A ranger named Michael, who'd been with the park for over 20 years, said it best. It wasn't fear in the bears. It was responsibility. Like they weren't running from the earth. They were standing with it. That's what lingered. Not the tremors, not even the mystery, but the posture of the bears, grounded, unshaken, waiting. And now, with the earth beginning to stir, their warning seemed less like folklore and more like foresight. But even then, most people moved on. The media cycle turned. The road was reopened, and tourists came back with cameras, smiling in front of hot springs that hissed under their breath. Still, those who paid attention, those who really watched, noticed that not all had returned. Some of the grizzlies had vanished into the higher ridges, the deep woods, the forgotten valleys where no maps reached, and among them was one that no one forgot. A silver figure, a grizzly unlike the others. He had lingered longer, left last, moved like he carried something the others couldn't bear. They started calling him Nanook. There's something ancient in the way an animal pauses before a storm, something wordless and wise. Long before seismographs and sensors, before news alerts and algorithms, there were creatures who knew how to listen to the land, not with tools, but with bodies tuned like instruments. Animals have always carried this quiet intelligence, not one learned in books but carved into their bones by generations of survival, silence. and stillness. And now, as people debated the strange events on Highway 191, that old truth returned like a forgotten hymn. How could they have known? That's what everyone kept asking, from researchers to rangers to the farmer who watched from his porch, hands clenched around a warm mug he never drank. It didn't make sense to the logical mind, but deep down, it felt true. Maybe it was the way the grizzlies didn't panic. They weren't running. They were alert, present, like sentinels. And for many, that presence triggered something deeply human: memory. Stories began to surface, not from the media, but from hearts that had held these moments quietly for years. A woman in Bozeman recalled her dog refusing to enter the house moments before her father collapsed from an unseen stroke. A tribal elder shared a tale passed down of a bear circling a sick child's tent for 3 nights, only leaving after the fever broke. A man whose horse refused to trail the morning before a rock slide buried it completely. These weren't just anecdotes. They were testimonies, witnesses to a language most of us forgot how to speak. And isn't it strange that in our age of science and proof, it takes the animal to remind us what it means to feel? The story unfolding in Yellowstone wasn't just about grizzlies. It was about us, about what we've lost in the noise of modern life. Our intuition, our trust in the unseen, our belief that not everything sacred can be measured. Because somewhere along the road, many of us stopped looking up at the stars, or down at the soil, or into the eyes of a wild creature and asking, "What do you see that I can't?" The rescue here wasn't just physical. It wasn't just about escaping danger. It was about recovering something human that had been dulled by convenience and disconnectedness. And perhaps the bears, especially the grizzlies, were offering more than a warning. Perhaps they were inviting us to remember. It's not about romanticizing the animal. It's about honoring the relationship. These beings don't live by our clocks or codes. Yet somehow, they carry a grace that humbles even the most enlightened among us. One biologist, after watching hours of footage, said it best: they didn't just respond to a shift in the earth, they felt it before it began. That sentence struck a chord, because what if that's what faith really is? Not certainty, but a listening heart. And suddenly the silence of the bears, their stillness on that highway, it wasn't passive, it was prayerful. They weren't frozen, they were communing. And the more this idea spread, the more people found themselves looking differently at the animal world. At the crow who returns to the same fence post each morning. At the cat who won't leave their grandmother's side. At the deer who appeared just after the funeral. It wasn't coincidence, it was story, it was connection, it was something real. And in that soft remembering, the silver bear, Nanook, stood apart. Not because he was bigger, but because his stillness held something sacred. He had waited, yes. But why? That question lingered. And it would only begin to find shape when Nanook chose to walk away, but not before offering one last look. He didn't roar, he didn't charge. He simply stood, and the whole forest felt quieter for it. They started calling him Nanook. No one knows who said it first, but the name spread as naturally as wind through pine. Some said it was a word from the old languages. Others believed it meant guardian or silent one, in stories passed down long before maps carved Yellowstone into borders. Nanook was different. Among the hundreds of bears that had gathered on the highway, he stood apart. Not because he was the largest, but because something in his presence made people stop thinking. He was silver-backed, weathered, with a scar that ran like a branch down his right side. Not fresh, not angry, just carried. He arrived last, and he stayed longest. While the others had slowly begun to disappear into the trees, one by one, like sentinels released from duty, Nanook remained, on the ridge, watching. Some rangers said he hadn't moved, in over an hour. Others swore his eyes had met theirs. A woman passing through with her son said, "He looked at me like he knew I'd forgotten something." She didn't explain what. Even among those who claimed to not be the spiritual type, there was something in Nanuk's stillness that felt like a sermon. He didn't need a pulpit, just snow, stone, and the sky turning amber behind his silhouette. Many stories followed. Someone saw him standing in the moonlight alone, the wind pulling softly at his fur like a veil. Another said he turned his head just slightly, as if listening for something the rest of us could never hear. A man from Idaho called it the closest thing to God I've ever seen. But what made Nanuk more than a bear, what carved him into story, was what he represented. He wasn't just the last to leave. He was the final punctuation, the slow exhale, the quiet knowing, the way he stayed after the tremors began, the way he watched the mountains before any fault line cracked, the way he didn't fear. That was the part people couldn't shake. Because in a world where fear is loud and constant, Nanuk taught something different. That strength can be silent. That warning can be gentle. That presence, real presence, speaks louder than noise. For those who believe in signs, Nanuk was the sign, not of doom, but of invitation, to pause, to remember, to respect what we don't understand, and protect what we still have. He reminded people that not all rescue stories involve sirens. Sometimes the rescue comes in the form of a creature who doesn't move until you feel the weight of your own stillness. The video of Nanuk standing alone was shared millions of times, not because he did anything dramatic, but because he didn't. In a culture obsessed with action, his calm refusal to act was the action. And in that silence, something opened. It wasn't about the bear anymore. It was about what he awakened in people. An ache, a reverence, a memory that we belong to this earth, not as masters but as kin. Nanuk walked away eventually, but not before turning his head one last time toward the humans watching from behind fences and glass and blinking cameras. He didn't blink, he just looked. And for many, that was enough. But the message? That was still unfolding, carried not in his paw prints, but in the hearts of those who couldn't forget his silence. There was no explosion, no earthquake, no catastrophe. The ground trembled quietly for a few days, then settled. Life in Yellowstone returned to its rhythm, tourists with cameras, rangers with routines, winds tracing old paths through the valleys. But something had changed. Not outside, inside, because the story didn't end when the bears left. It began there. People who'd witnessed the gathering spoke about it in whispers, like you do when talking about something sacred. It wasn't just about animals on a road. It was about the feeling that something was trying to speak, not through language, but through presence. There was no official explanation. Geologists released a few reports noting unusual but non-threatening seismic activity. Biologists suggested food patterns or seasonal shifts might have influenced the animals. But no theory fully explained why so many grizzlies and black bears, creatures known for their solitary nature, had moved together in silence toward a human highway, and why they had watched. One wildlife photographer wrote, "I've been filming animals for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. They weren't confused. They were deliberate." Another ranger, after 15 years on the job, quietly left her post. In her words, "Once you feel that kind of reverence, it's hard to go back to treating this place like scenery." For many, this was more than a strange animal event. It was a rescue story, not of a person saved, but of a perspective recovered. In churches, people lit candles and prayed, saying the bears were a sign from God. In online forums, others called it a miracle. Some claimed it was the spirit of the earth rising up to speak. Others simply said, "I don't know what it was, but I'll never forget how it made me feel." And maybe that is the point, because we live in a time where so much is loud, voices on screens, opinions shouted over truth, distractions piled on top of beauty. But the bears? They said nothing. They stood. They watched. And they reminded us that some messages are delivered in silence. Maybe the question isn't what the bears were warning us about. Maybe the question is, what are we refusing to hear? We build walls to keep the wild out, then wonder why we feel empty inside. We pave roads through sacred land, then act surprised when the earth tries to answer back. We separate animals from ourselves, calling them other, forgetting they feel, grieve, and sense with a depth we've long abandoned. But that day on Highway 191, the wild didn't fight us. It just stood in front of us, blocking the path not with violence but with quiet strength. And then, slowly, it stepped back. That's the part that haunts people. Because the message wasn't about destruction, it was about invitation. An invitation to listen before it's too late, to recognize the sacred in what we've deemed background, to remember that animals, like the grizzly, like Nanook, have a kind of intelligence we ignore because it doesn't fit inside our charts. Maybe they were never trying to stop traffic. Maybe they were trying to stop us. From moving too fast, from forgetting too much, from ignoring too long. And now it's quiet again. But those who stood there, who watched the bears vanish into the trees, carry something different in their chest, a question that lingers, not about science, not about myth, but about what kind of story we want to keep telling before the animals go silent for good. As we reflect on the extraordinary story of the bears in Yellowstone, we can't help but ask, are we truly listening to the world around us? In our fast-paced lives, we often forget the profound wisdom that nature holds. The bears' silent stand on Highway 191 wasn't just a moment in time. It was a quiet plea for us to pause, to listen, and to reconnect with the earth. How many times have we ignored the subtle signs that something is wrong? How often do we rush past the beauty and the messages that animals, the earth, and the natural world are trying to send us? The story of these bears reminds us that there is much more to learn if we're willing to open our hearts and ears to the silent whispers of nature. If you found yourself moved by this tale, take a moment to reflect on your own connection with the world around you. And if this story sparked something within you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's so much more to explore in these stories of hope, wisdom, and connection. Let's continue to learn, listen, and grow together.